Alright, I should be streaming now. I've never attempted to do anything sort of serious before. I would like to read a story, a book my mom read to me as a kid. I read it to her as she lay dying in the hospital this past Friday, and I didn't get through the whole book. So I thought I'd put on the video of the Yule log, which was always her favorite program to watch on Christmas. She liked to have it on, as she did things. And I figured I'd finish reading the book. That way, at least I could say it was done. I'm starting a book, The Tainted Sword. It was out of print, and my mom had trouble finding the other two. She never found the other two in the trilogy, and I have them now, but of course she never read them, and I never got through them in the hospital. She died very suddenly. So, I don't know. If I can make it through one, I'm going to make it through all three, I think. We'll see how it goes. Sorry, just give me a minute. This is harder than I thought it would be. Man, and all this here is the fireplace. Alright, so this is The Tainted Sword. The first one is by DJ Heinrich. I think he died writing the second book, and the second and third were finished with his notes. Let's see. Second and third, well, DJ Heinrich and DJ Heinrich. I think they might have been ghostwritten. I'm pretty sure he died after the first one, and in the middle of the second one. It's called the Penhaligon Trilogy. The first book's called The Tainted Sword. And it's a Dungeons and Dragons novel. Let's see, where's the copyright on it? 92. So it's only a couple years old, I guess. And I apologize, I titled the video out of print. I don't know if they reprinted the book, but I really doubt it. And unfortunately, I don't have a camera or a good quality microphone. But there are, it was written in the time when people did novels. They put pictures of maps in the front, and they look sort of a low quality. Well, it's a good quality drawn style, but it looks simpler and, without perspective or anything. So it's more important for landmarks. It looks like someone might have used in a fantasy type thing. They're very beautiful color pictures. So if you can find the book on eBay, I recommend it. So I'm not going to read the little blurb in the front. So here's the dedication for Jim, without whom this book would have never been. Alright. Flynn, Flynn, the fallen fool! Flynn, the fallen! The taunts ripped loudly through the cold winter air. Children raced about the man on the griffin and continued their chant, their words growing more bold and cruel when nearby adults did not chastise them. One man, a baker by the look of his flour-covered apron, even cheered his son's viciousness. He made a wicked gesture with his hands, and then turned towards his companions and laughed. "Flynn the fool! Flynn the mighty is no more!" The baker shouted spitefully. A young woman edged closer, her tall, lanky frame moving gracefully through the onlookers. A gust of wind blew her braided hair into her face, and she tossed the reddish plait to her back. Her clean, calloused hands gripped her leather belt, which bound a shift to her thin waist. Joanna Menhir had yet to see her 20th year, but her clear gray eyes held wisdom. Wisdom gleaned from 13 years spent as an orphan on the streets of the Specularium. Jo had lived in the southernmost seaport city until recently, when she journeyed north and found herself in this tiny village of Bywater. Jo's gaze slid from the baker to the man surrounded by the growing mob of children. She scanned his rough leather and fur attire and noticed that he wore no armor. He wore no hat, and iron-gray streaks filled his once black hair. Wind and sun had deeply tanned his face, which was marked by scars and wrinkles. He looked neither right nor left, to one hand callously gripping the griffin's reins and the other hand holding the lead to the pack mule that followed close behind. His breath formed white puffs in the early winter air. The man's griffin appeared to have abnormally short wings, but Joe thought that might be because they were tucked close to the beast's body. She stared at the creature's front legs. Why are his claws gripping those strange leather balls, she wondered. After the griffin paced forward, she saw why. The bird lion's talons weren't made for walking long distances, and the leather bags cushioned them between the impact of the beast's claws and the ground. Joanna searched the rider's face again. His stern, straight lips were partially hidden by a drooping mustache. His eyes betrayed no emotion, but he seemed unaware of the taunting children, the stares from the adults, and the unease that spread from him in waves. Could this old man really be Flynn the Mighty? Bad fortune had tossed Joe off the path of the castle of the Three Sons, the home of Baroness Arteris Penhaligon, for whom Joe had hoped to petition for knighthood. Now she was stranded in a little village of Bywater, some 60 miles southeast of the castle, or so the village blacksmith had told her. Joe had never expected to come across Flynn, the knight who had fallen from grace 7 years ago. Like most everyone back in far-off Specularium, Joe assumed he had died shortly after his disgrace. I'm going to take a drink. Hold on. Sorry. Yet, if Flynn the Mighty still lives, surely he would be treated with respect and reverence, and not this insolence, Joe thought. She sidled her way through the crowd and got in closer to the warrior. For her 19 years she had listened to the tales of Flynn the Mighty and had developed a fascination for the man of legend. He, if anyone, could advise her on petitioning the Baroness Arteris. Inadvertently, Joe watched the man called Flynn pull his griffin to a halt and dismount before Bywater's only supply store. The white walls and brass sconces of Baladon's Mercantile gleamed in the morning sun. A large, ornately painted sign swung overhead, proclaiming the establishment's name. The double doors with a window to either side marked the center of the building. Half a dozen hitching posts, each with 2 brass rings, fronted the shop. A single wooden bench painted bright red stood to the left of the door. The shop's air of tidy prosperity contrasted sharply with the despair of an abandoned winery to its left and the ramshackle look of Garman's pottery to its right. The griffin screeched a shrill eagle-like scream and reared. Joe's attention turned toward the mount. His golden eyes were swirling in terror. The crowd's jeers clearly made the animal skittish. His claws released the balls as he reared again, and the pads dangled from thin chains attached to the creature's ankles. The rider stroked the silky feathers of the griffin's neck and calmly urged him back to the ground. Joe watched Flynn tie his mount and the pack mule to a hitching ring. His jaw clenched as he shouldered the crowd out of his way. The griffin snapped at the children, sending them scurrying back. A slight smile formed on Flynn's lips. The warrior then muzzled the skittish griffin, which nipped once or twice before submitting. The children, seeing the griffin's muzzle, grew bolder. Their chants rang louder, and more joined in. 1 or 2 of them even poked the griffin's haunches with sticks, but backed away after being struck by its thick line-like tail. Flynn resolutely ignored the children and began unloading the mule. Why isn't he putting the brats in their place, Joe wondered. The children reminded her of the gangs infesting Specularium. They lay in wait and attacked passers-by. Rich victims were robbed, poor victims were tormented. Joe had witnessed enough gangs to know that one centered on Flynn verged on violence. From the corner of the eye, her eye, Joe saw a boy pick up a rock from the muddy, partially frozen road. He was a big youth, easily as tall as Joe. His eyes were puffy slits, and he wore a deep-lined pout. Just the sort of boy to spark a riot, Joe thought. She touched a brown furry tail hanging from her belt and spoke a magical phrase that sounded like a growl. She blinked out of existence and reappeared before the boy, who had been at least 20 paces away. Joe struck at the youth's hand, knocking the rock from it. The boy gasped as he knelt, admitting a low growl again, and touched the tail at her belt. She reappeared in the thick of the crowd and slowly rose from her crouch. In the bustle of the street, her sudden appearance went unnoticed. Cautiously, Joe looked toward the youth, taking care to keep a person or two between her and the boy. He was looking around, befuddled, trying to find his attacker. At last he shook his head and faded into the crowd. Joe turned back to the man with the griffin, a smirk crossing her lips. She froze. Flynn's dark eyes were on her. Had he seen her use the blink dog's tail? His cold gaze remained inscrutable. Turning, he continued unloading the mule. Joe rubbed her hands and stepped forward boldly, leaving the crowd of adults and breaking the line of children circling Flynn. It's a girl's voice, though. You've trained your griffin well, Sir Flynn, Joe said, nodding toward the mule and horse tied together. Either him or your mule. Not many griffins would pass up a meal of horse flesh. The man looked down at Joanna. He was very tall, a head taller than Joe. A fiercely curving scar sliced along his left jawline and nicked his throat. A second scar cut through his left eyebrow. His eyes were deep brown, nearly black. Joe caught the briefest twitch of his mustache, and she wondered whether he were amused or angered, or both. I'm no longer a knight, so don't address me as such, he said coldly. He gestured toward the animals and added grudgingly, They're both well trained. Ariak, the griffin, hasn't had horse flesh in years. What does he eat if not horse flesh? Joe asked, interested. When I worked for a hostler, the griffins were almost always attacked by the horses. The warrior paused at the knot he was unraveling and flicked his gaze at Joanna. Then he turned back to the mule. He's happy enough with fox or bear, whatever I trap. It helps that he's crippled and can't fly. Flynn replied, hefting the last bundle off the mule. He turned his way towards the shop. You might pack that fly swatter of yours away. It'll get you in trouble. Surprised, Joe touched the blink dog's tail and stroked the thin, bristly fur. So he had noticed, Joanna grimaced. Then hurriedly tucked the tail inside her bag. Glancing at the shop, she followed Flynn. Enough! Someone roared. Enough of this badgering! You pups! A burly man burst out of the shop's double doors, throwing both open at once. I'll not have you pestering my customers. Now get along, all of you, or I'll... The merchant cuffed one child on the ears when she didn't get out of the way fast enough to please him. Joe glanced at the sign above the man's head. This must be Baladon, she thought. Baladon, sorry. Ah, Flynn, the merchant said, beaming. His tanned, shiny face was framed with huge sideburns that covered much of his cheeks, perhaps to compensate for the lack of hair above. One or two extra chins graced the shopkeeper's neck. His bloody butcher's apron was draped over a sleeveless, dirty gray tunic, and a pair of even dirtier brown breeches. He wore sandals despite the cold, and Joe saw bright spots of blood splattered on them. The merchant stepped forward, and he and Flynn clasped each other's wrists. Come in, Flynn! You haven't had anything worth my money this year. And Baladon left and returned to his shop. Flynn followed with his loads of furs. Discreetly, Joe followed too, bent on discovering more about the man who had always been a legend to her. She eagerly passed through the doors of the mercantile. Alright, well, this is, I think, where I'm going to stop. And, yeah, I hope people will continue to listen because I will do this whether they do or not. I don't actually care.